Welcome back, everybody, to the Aurora Show, and I'm going to start my First Contact series, First Contact Summer series. So I've been kind of talking a little bit about, the astrology of this summer. We're going to get into June, July, and August, and the configurations we have going on, as well as just my downloads that have been coming through about the summer, why I'm calling it First Contact Summer. We're going to talk about Barbolt's basket and all that good stuff. So I thought we're going to start part one of this series with just an overview. I found some really great research of just kind of the timeline of in our modern times of UFO or UAPs, as they call them now, phenomenon. Right. And I'm referring to them in that way because that's how everybody knows them. I think that there's been a lot of contact since the inception, right, of the planet, and with what I would call galactics and not UFOs, but nonetheless. And, there's also the question of who have they been contacting, right? Because there are a lot of interdimensional beings and galactic races that some have been nefarious, right? And some have been of the light. So it's kind of the question of who have they been contacting? How do we piece this all together, right? Because you can go back as far as watching the show Ancient Aliens, which used to be one of my favorite shows ever. And they would pretty much go around the world, right, and show you ancient paintings, sculptures, statues, hieroglyphics, where ancient cultures were always depicting contact, right? So when I'm talking about First Contact Summer, as I've said, I'm talking about it in a different way. I will get into that more of where I feel we are having first contact with the new earth. Because contact, right, which I'll go through my notes, has been happening since the beginning, right? And so, but it's kind of fun to look at this, and just see kind of the timeline of events. So, ancient sightings, a lot of this I got from, New Space Economy website. And they just did an overview of kind of the history of UFO sightings, right? And so, they talk first about biblical references and ancient texts, right? So I'm not going to spend too much time on the ancient stuff. Like I said, go watch Ancient Aliens, read any history book. There is tons of depictions of what we would call contact. We can even go back to, kind of the original Anunnaki invasion, right? So this has been happening for a long time. We're going to focus more on modern times, but in terms of biblical references and ancient texts, they said UFO sightings have been referenced throughout history, including religious texts such as the Bible. Shocking, right? They gave an example and said in one of the chapters of the Bible, Ezekiel's vision of a wheel within a wheel is often cited by modern UFO theorists as a potential description of an extraterrestrial craft. They said in medieval and Renaissance times, there were numerous historical accounts describing strange objects in the sky, and this was often interpreted through some type of religious or superstitious belief at the time, right? Now let's jump to more modern history. Okay, so the 1830s to 1890s is a period that they noted here of where there seemed to be an increased reporting of UFOs, right? So pre-1830s, did it happen? I'm sure it did, but this is the most where it started to increase. So the 1830s to 90s, reports of mysterious airships began appearing across the United States and other countries. These sightings often described large circular-like objects moving through the sky. These events are considered part of a broader phenomenon of the earliest modern UFO sightings, right? Now, of course, I'm going to talk about the astrology because I think this will make sense down the line. Again, I'm going to get into a lot of Barbault's research. As I mentioned before, André Barbault was a French astrologer, and he really studied the transits of the outer planets. So Jupiter, I don't know if he included Jupiter as often, but Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. And this is how he made his predictions, right? And he studied mundane astrology. And so he predicted the fall of the USSR in 1989. He predicted it 30 years prior to that. In 2011, he predicted the pandemic of 2020. And he also predicted, his last prediction, he's passed now, was the summer of 2026, due to the configuration of the outer planets, right? And I've been saying how this is why astrologers are so excited. This is why it's monumental, because right now and for the foreseeable future, right, in our timeline here, is that we will have Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune all in a very harmonious configuration. Okay, so Uranus and Gemini, Pluto and Aquarius, air signs. They're going to be trine to one another for the next 7 years while Uranus is in Gemini. Okay, Neptune and Aries is in a sextile to both Pluto and Uranus. Okay, so this is a very interesting configuration. We also have Saturn in the mix, who is also sextiling Uranus and Pluto right now until he moves into Taurus. And so let's look a little bit about the astrology in these kind of modern UFO sightings, right? So from 1830 to 1834, Pluto was in Aries. That was probably a wild time. And it was in a square to Neptune and Capricorn. So when you have outer planetary squares, it's a little harsh. But what caught my eye more about this, again, because as I'm looking at this research, they're starting in the 1830s saying this is where the reports start really rolling in, right? Again, previous to that, we can find it in ancient text. I'm sure if we look through the 1700s, right, there might have been reports of it. But why is it that this time period is kind of noted as the beginning of when UFO sightings, paranormal activity seem to increase? Now, I do want to note something here. Okay, so Uranus was also in Aquarius during this time. I'm going to circle back to that. Uranus is the modern ruler of Aquarius, okay? And we will see later down the timeline, Uranus and Aquarius in general, okay, has a lot to do with the contact of something that is out of bounds, something that is outside of the norm and the mundane, right? So Aquarius has come to actually, in modern times, rule UFOs, UAPs, galactics, technology that supersedes, you know, what we know in our modern world, quantum physics, right? So Uranus was in Aquarius during the early 1830s. I think that's interesting. Now, it's also interesting to note that during this time between the 1830s and 1890s, this is when Neptune was discovered. Okay, so Neptune was discovered later in like the 1850s to 60s, right? Now, there's a great book that I will be referencing later in this series. And the astrologer who wrote that book was writing a book about Pluto, but he also talks about Neptune and Uranus in that book, right? And he says that according to his research, and he has done extensive research on this, about 30 years, and he links this to Saturn, because Saturn takes approximately 30 years to move through the zodiac. Saturn is the ruler of time. He often says that about 30 years before a planet is discovered, it starts to have influence on the consciousness. Okay. And he also later talks about when a planet is demoted, such as Pluto, it takes about 30 years for its influence to kind of wane out of the consciousness. So in the 1830s, this was approximately 30 years or less before Neptune was discovered. Now, Neptune has also come to represent paranormal activity, the occult, the psyche, right? intuition, psychic senses, psychic abilities. So that's interesting to note that this is also when the UFO sightings start to really increase, was around the influence of when Neptune was going to be discovered as a planet who has come to rule all these things. The weird, the esoteric, the behind the veil energy, right? The paranormal activities, okay? And Uranus was in Aquarius. Okay, so then 1835 to 1843, we still had Pluto in Aries, and we then had Neptune in Aquarius. So the dissolver of the veil was now in Aquarius, meaning we were starting to see more of what was going on. And that's probably another reason why these sightings were increasing, okay? 1843 to 1851, we actually had Pluto in Aries conjunct Uranus in Aries, volatile, but we still had, and then we had a sextile to Neptune in Aquarius. Now, 1851 to 1859, Pluto now moves into Taurus, right? A deep revolution here around the physical reality. So that kind of indicates to me as well that this is when things really started to change. The physical reality started to change, which is very Taurian. Uranus was also in Taurus. So there was shakeups to what we viewed at this period of time as tangible reality, right? Now they were both in a sextile to Neptune in Pisces, okay? And as we know in modern times, Neptune is the ruler of Pisces, okay? So Aquarius is the weird, the UFOs, the aliens, the quantum physics, the things that are very taboo and outside of our norm and interesting, right? Makes us kind of question reality. Pisces, being modernly ruled by Neptune, has become more of this spiritual planet, right? It is the occult. It is the things that you sense that you cannot see. It is the energy, right? Pisces will teach us a lot about working with energy, understanding dimensions, entities, right? This is very Neptune and Piscean, and Neptune was in Pisces at that time. Now, 1859 to 1865. We had Neptune in Aries, which we currently have now, and we also had Uranus in Gemini. So that's interesting. Similar configuration, although Pluto was in Taurus at the time. 1865 to 1871, Pluto still in Taurus, Neptune still in Aries, but they were squaring, Neptune was squaring Uranus in Cancer. Okay, and Cancer has a lot to do with our lineage, where we come from, our origins, our ancestors, right? Whereas its sister sign Capricorn is more focused on what is the legacy we are building moving forward, whereas Cancer is focused on what have we inherited? Where have we come from? And so there could have been a lot, again, I don't have a ton of research on this time period, but there could have been a lot of questions at that time of what are our origins, right? Like, do we come from the stars? Are UFOs a part of our ancestry, right? There could have been questions around that. Now, finally, 1871 to 1880, we had Neptune in Taurus, right? So that, I think that was also a time that, the Theosophy Society was taking off. There was a very renewed interest in the magical spiritual worlds, in the occult, and they were, Neptune and Pluto and Taurus were squaring Uranus and Leo. Okay, so very interesting times, right? Let's jump to modern times here. So interestingly, the research jumps from ending around 1890 and jumps to the 1940s. So again, I find that a little bit interesting. And we'll see why. So we jump to the 1940s, and this is where they say the modern UFO era begins. Now remember, in the 1940s during World War II, a lot of the lore around what was going on, right, with World War II, there is plenty of records to indicate that the Nazis were researching and experimenting with hovercraft technology. And there was lots of myths and lores about, did they receive this information? Did they receive this research from extraterrestrials? Because they were actively testing hovercraft technology. And this leads us, to later post-World War II, where you wonder why Project Paperclip happened, which was when the United States brought over all the Nazi scientists and hired them to work in the government. You have to wonder what was really going on there. Now, so that's just a little preface. Now, also 1941, they had the Cape Girardeau incident. I am totally not pronouncing that correctly, which was reported in Missouri, in the United States, where a UFO crash and alien bodies were allegedly recovered by the US military. Although details are debated, it is often cited by researchers. Okay. Now, during the early 40s here, we had Pluto and Leo, which is interesting to note because we have Pluto in Aquarius right now, which is the opposing sign. Leo and Aquarius do have a lot to do with the idea of what is normal, right? Because Leo is all about the self and all about the celebration of the uniqueness of the self-expression. And Aquarius is kind of the celebration of the uniqueness of all. And that's why with Pluto and Aquarius, we're getting this kind of, energy of like, what lies beyond what we know, right? Like, what is normal? And the bounds are being tested of what is normal. So I just think that was interesting. We also had Neptune and Virgo in the early 40s as well. And Virgo loves the details. Virgo loves for things to make sense. So Neptune was actually in its fall in Virgo because it's the modern ruler of Pisces. And so things were probably not making sense around that time. There was confusion, right? The things we normally think are logical and 1 + 2 = 3, those things were being questioned. Now, Uranus was also in Gemini for most of the 40s, 1941 to 1948. So remember that, okay? Because if we go back to the 1800s portion, right? Uranus was in Gemini from 1859 to 1865, right at the height of when this UFO activity was being reported. Here we jump again, right? To the 1940s. Uranus is in Gemini. Uranus is now in Gemini. So you can see kind of the patterns here that are leading up to why we're talking about first contact. Why are we mentioning this? Because it's carrying a story. Okay, 1947, we jump a little bit later in the 40s. There was a Kenneth Arnold sighting occurred near Mount Rainier, Washington. This person reported seeing 9 flying saucers. And this event was considered one of the biggest beginnings of the UFO era, right? So in the later 40s, we still had Pluto in Leo, but we had Neptune move into Libra. And Uranus was in Gemini. So a similar configuration to what we have today, because Neptune in Libra was trine to Uranus and Gemini, and in a sextile to Pluto and Leo. That's a similar configuration that we have right now in terms of aspects being had with these outer planets. Then we had the most famous, probably the 1947 Roswell incident, where an object crashed near Roswell, New Mexico, leading to widespread speculation that it was a UFO. Okay, the 1948 Mantell UFO incident. This occurred with Captain Thomas Mantell, who was a pilot in the Kentucky Air National Guard, who died while pursuing a UFO. And again, with these two events, it says that later on, the government claimed that it was a weather balloon. Because obviously this was not something they were going to disclose to the public. And that made me think about, I think it was a year or two ago, right? Where, remember those weird things that were hovering over, and I don't know if I can't remember if it was California or the east coast of the US, but they ended up telling us that they were weather balloons from China or some shit. It made me think about that, where I was like, were they weather balloons? You know, just kind of, again, funny that they've been doing this for a long time, telling us these like ridiculous stories to make us kind of distracted, right? Finally, in 1948, Project Sign was initiated by the U.S. Air Force, which was the first official government study of UFOs. This project aimed to determine whether UFOs posed a national threat, posed a threat to national security. So very interesting. So right at the tail end of Uranus and Gemini, this is when they officially launched this project to study UFOs. So we can guarantee pretty much that since then, they have been studying them, right? Now, let's jump to the 1950s here. So 1950, these words are going to kill me, McMinnville UFO photographs were taken in Oregon by two locals. These are some of the most famous photographs that have ever been taken and remain unexplained. Okay. 1952, there was an incident in Washington, D.C., where radar detected multiple unidentified objects over the U.S. Capitol. Fighter jets were scrambled, but the objects disappeared and reappeared in a series of incidents. Now, I do want to note something else, that as I'm reading through a lot of these incidents here, like the 1947 incidents, the Kenneth Arnold sighting and the Roswell incident, both happened in June and July in the 40s. And then the two I just mentioned, the McMinnville and the Washington, D.C. incident, both also happened in the summertime. Just another interesting note. And so here in the early 1950s, we have Pluto in Leo, okay? And we had Neptune in Libra for 1950, 1955. So again, those two were in a sextile, similar to what we have right now. We also had Uranus in Cancer, 1950, 1956. What does that link us back to? That links us back to the 1860s when Uranus was in Cancer. Again, kind of shaking up the idea of where we come from and what our lineage is and, you know, what our ancestry is. And this led to 1952 Project Blue Book, which was launched by the U.S. Air Force. This was a kind of a rename to the Project Sign that was launched in 1948. They kind of renamed it, and it became the most extensive official investigation into UFO sightings. Then in 1957, we have the Levelland UFO case in Texas, which involved multiple witnesses reporting a large glowing object that caused vehicles to stall. The event remains one of the most well-documented UFOs sightings in history. Okay. And then in 1959, we have the Dyatlov Pass incident, which occurred in Russia, in the Soviet Union, where 9 hikers died under mysterious circumstances. It has been speculated that UFO activity was involved, but there's no concrete evidence to support this. So in the later 50s here, we actually had Pluto move into Virgo. So again, a kind of deep restructuring over what we think we know. Virgo is the details. Virgo is the logic. Virgo is what makes sense, right? Virgo also is like health and wellness, right? And kind of understanding how the human body works, right? Its sister sign of Pisces is the soul. It's the soul, the higher self, the immortal part of us. While Virgo is very much the mortal part of us. It's the body, it's the human being and how we function. And it's how you combine those. How do you combine the unexplainable, which is very Piscean, with Virgo, which is that everything can be explained, right? Science is very Virgoian, right? It's that everything can be explained, everything can be tested. There's always an answer, right? And so Pluto was in Virgo in the later 50s, where I think this is where things started to really change in terms of what can we prove, right? And Neptune had also moved into Scorpio in 1955 onward. So Neptune in Scorpio was also in a sextile to Pluto in Virgo. This will keep repeating itself, okay? And of course, Neptune in Scorpio, right? Neptune, the esoteric, the occult, the consciousness in Scorpio, which is about wanting to unearth what has been hidden, what needs to be revealed, right? So that, I think, really plays into this 1959 incident where these unexplainable deaths happened, right? Now, the 1960s, this is where they label this period as that there was growing public interest and government scrutiny. Basically, people were starting to get more interested in like these events and what's going on. And a lot of people were starting to scrutinize the government in the 60s. The 60s was a wild time, right? And again, this is where you started to have a lot of counterculture, the free love movement. There was also a lot of kind of MK Ultra style things going on. This is when they started experimenting on people with like LSD and things. So the 60s was kind of this wild time where people were really anti-government. They were anti-war. They wanted to live a different lifestyle, right? And that kind of sparked a lot of what the famous things we see from the 60s, right? So 1961, we had as far as I'm aware, the first abduction case. The Betty and Barney Hill abduction in New Hampshire became the first widely publicized alien abduction case. The Hills claimed to have taken aboard a UFO and they were subjected to medical examinations by extraterrestrial beings. I've talked about this before where the Greys did make an agreement. This was back in the Eisenhower days, so I think this was right around this time. And so they were supposedly, allegedly, actually given permission to do this. But that's another, I don't know how much I can like say on videos, but that is when abductions really began. They actually were given permission to do these. And it was just a weird time. And so Pluto was in Virgo, right? Conjunct Uranus in Virgo. So think Virgo, right? Experimentation. It's exactly what we're talking about here. These people claim they were abducted and subjected to medical examinations by extraterrestrial beings. That is so Uranus and Virgo. It's not even funny, right? Remember, Uranus is the ruler of Aquarius. So we're talking about things that are unexpected. We're talking about things that are out of bounds. We're talking about things that are paranormal in essence. And Virgo being the body, Virgo being health and wellness, Virgo being how the body functions, science, experimentation, right? And then, of course, Pluto and Uranus in Virgo were sextiling Neptune and Aquarius, which there are kind of the dark underbelly of the consciousness. There is nefarious things going on. We're trying to figure out what lies beneath the surface here. And that seems to be very much exemplified here in the 60s. We then have the 1964 Lonnie Zamora incident, which occurred in New Mexico, involving a police officer witnessing a UFO landing and two small beings near the craft. This event remains unexplained, but is one of the most well documented. 1965, we have the Kecksburg UFO incident in Pennsylvania, involving a fireball seen over several states and an object that allegedly crashed in the woods. Witnesses reported seeing a bell-shaped object, and this has been compared to as big as the Roswell incident. And again, what have we been seeing in our own modern times? Sonic booms that are unexplained, lots of quote-unquote meteor crashes, fireballs seen in the sky. History doesn't always repeat, but it sure does rhyme. And again, I think we're at we're in a precipice moment, okay? Now, 1966. The Michigan swamp gas case involved multiple sightings of UFOs, which were later explained by astronomer Alan Hynek as swamp gas. I have no idea what that means, but that's kind of random, right? But again, with the Neptune and Pluto conjunction in Virgo, a lot of this makes sense to me astrologically. Neptune and Scorpio, right? That can be unexplained deaths. And Virgo being health and wellness, we're thinking poisons, we're thinking that makes total sense. Swamp gas, okay, whatever that means. 1967, the Shag Harbor incident in Canada involved a UFO crash off the coast of Nova Scotia. The Canadian government investigated the event, but no explanation was found. Shocking. Remember, Neptune and Scorpio, a lot of things would be hidden during this time, but everybody's sensing them. But there's a lot of suppression. There's a lot of hidden things happening, unexplained things that are being suppressed. And then finally, we have 1969. Here's what's interesting to me. Project Blue Book termination. You know, I've heard that before. I've heard lots of times how all these government projects and things have been shut down and they're not happening anymore, right? It takes me, we'll get to the 70s in a second. I'll talk about the church committees of 1975. But they always say something was ended. Something was shut down. Yeah, we're not doing that anymore. I don't buy it for a second. Project Blue Book was officially terminated. The final report concluded that UFOs were not a threat to national security and that most sightings could be explained by natural or man-made phenomenon. Again, Neptune and Scorpio, suppression, hidden, keeping truth hidden. Okay, now we get to the 70s, and they called this chapter Abductions and Close Encounters. Okay, 1973, the Pascagoula abduction involved two men who claimed to have been abducted by strange creatures while fishing in Mississippi. Their story gained significant media attention. Okay, now from 1970 to 1975, we had Pluto in Libra conjunct Uranus in Libra, and they were in a sextile to Neptune and Sagittarius. Now, this is a little different from Neptune and Scorpio, right? So the Pluto and Uranus in Libra is a shakeup about relationships, how we relate to other people, right? Our sense of justice, all of that. Now, Neptune and Sag is interesting because Sagittarius is about knowledge. It's about expansion. Sagittarius is often like associated with travel, global events, right? Things that affect us more on kind of a global level. But Sagittarius is also about truth, right? And it's about exploration. It's about adventure. It's about knowledge that is gained through experience. So this is very interesting to me that the 70s kind of had this, you'll see that there's an increase in abductions here. And that almost feels to me like Neptune and Sag, because in the Neptune and Scorpio era, like we just talked about, there was a lot of things brushed under the rug. There was a lot of things suppressed. Everything was hidden. Everything was hush-hushed, right? And Neptune and Sag is kind of like, you can't suppress it anymore. It's almost like you have to learn and gain this spiritual knowledge, to gain this higher wisdom through experience. So it's almost like when these abductions started increasing, right? And this is where I think a lot of those movies come from, like The Fourth Kind, The Fifth Kind, if you've ever watched those, really, really fascinating stuff, right? And there's a lot of people, many of you out there who, if you were alive during this time, you might have heard a lot about these cases, or you yourself might have had weird experiences. I think this was a time where all of a sudden it was like, well, we're going to have to get the experience in order to gain the wisdom, because it's not being given to us. We're not getting the truth, right? Jump to 1975. The Travis Walton abduction in Arizona became one of the most famous abduction cases. Walton claimed to have been taken aboard a UFO and returned 5 days later. His story inspired the film Fire in the Sky. I've never seen that one. That sounds interesting. And again, what happened in 1975? The famous Senate Church Committee hearings. And you can look these up, during that committee hearing, the government was essentially on trial with the Senate. It wasn't a real trial, but it was a committee hearing. And it came out of Project Mockingbird, where the CIA was actively planting ops into the media. And it came out that journalists were actually CIA ops, people in Hollywood and media, and all of these people were basically writing propaganda for the CIA. Okay, Project Mockingbird. It also came out about MK and all of the nefarious and, quite frankly, out of control experiments that they had been doing on people. And then they had to come and answer about those things and say, oh, we're not doing that anymore. We're going to shut this project down. 1975. Now, 1976, the Tehran UFO incident. The Tehran incident occurred in Iran, where 2 Iranian Air Force jets, interceptors, attempted to engage a UFO. The pilots reported experiencing equipment malfunctions when they approached the object. Now, again, this takes us back to one of those previous ones where it talked about people experiencing a hovercraft or something. This was in 1957, I think, and it said that it caused their cars to stall. So that's also interesting, right? And so I feel this is, going to be an interesting conversation to have and we've also heard many reports over the years of government insiders and whistleblowers talking about nuclear weapons and saying that they've had experiences with spacecrafts and orbs or unidentified objects entering a field, right? And it shuts it down. It shuts those nuclear weapons down. They're not able to test them. So this is an interesting thing just to note, because as we move forward, if we do have increased galactic activity, it could cause a lot of our current technology to stall or not function. Again, it's because the frequencies don't align. Now, I do think this will lead to a lot of new innovation, right? We have to kind of advance in our technology, but just something interesting, right? Then in 1978, we have the Frederick Valentic disappearance in Australia, where a pilot who reported being followed by a UFO before disappearing without a trace. His aircraft was never found, and the case remains unsolved. This makes me think of that famous plane, and I can't remember how many years ago it was because I feel like I live in a constant Mandela effect. So I hope you guys remember this. When that aircraft disappeared, right? And they couldn't find it, and like it was missing. And then like, didn't they say they found it? Like it's a mandala, because I remember it disappeared and they couldn't find it and they couldn't find remnants of the plane. And then like a year later, they said they found it. It makes me think of the show Manifest as well on Netflix, if anyone's ever watched that, where a plane disappears for 5 years and then comes back. But essentially they like went through a portal or a wormhole. So that's also interesting. Okay, so now we jump to the 1980s. Government secrecy and new encounters is the theme here. So astrological wise, we still had Pluto in Libra from 1980 to 1985 in a sextile with Neptune in Sagittarius from 1980 to 1985. Okay. Now also Neptune was conjunct Uranus in Sagittarius from 81 to 88. So think unexplained events, unexplained experiences, right? Sagittarius is experience, which leads to wisdom, which leads to truth and knowledge. Now, 1980, the Rendlesham Forest incident in the UK involved US military personnel who were stationed here. They reported seeing strange lights and a triangular craft in the forest. This event is often referred to as Britain's Roswell. Now, here is where the government secrecy comes in. These next two incidents are 1986 and 1987. Okay. By that time, we had Pluto and Scorpio. For all my millennials, this is when shit got super intense because Pluto is the modern co-ruler of Scorpio. We will never have another Pluto and Scorpio generation, ever. This is when secrecy, nefariousness, really kind of dark stuff started to come out in the consciousness. And this is why millennials are the way they are, by the way. This is why we have this soul contract to literally unearth all this stuff and to bring it to the surface, is because we were born with Pluto and Scorpio. Now, Neptune was also in Capricorn starting in 1985. Okay, Neptune, right? The consciousness, sometimes it's a veil, sometimes it's illusion, sometimes it's truth. It's kind of a wish-wash there. Neptune and Capricorn. Capricorn represents governments. They created a lot of illusions and lies, okay? There was a smoke screen at this time around governments, right? And that coupled with, in a sextile, with Pluto and Scorpio is exactly this theme, government secrecy. 1986, the Japan airline flight incident involved a cargo plane flying over Alaska that was followed by a large UFO. The crew reported this incident to ground control, and they actually tracked this object on the radar. 1987, the Gulf Breeze UFO sightings in Florida involved a series of UFO sightings, including photographs and videos. This case gained widespread attention, but people later accused him of hoaxing the evidence. Exactly, right? 1990s, the rise of UFOlogy and disclosure efforts. Okay, 1991, Mexico City UFO sightings occurred during a solar eclipse and was captured on video by multiple witnesses. The footage showed a metallic disc hovering in the sky. And at this time, Pluto is still in Scorpio. Okay, Neptune is still in Capricorn. We also have Uranus in Capricorn. Okay, shakeups happening to the government, shakeups and disclosure happening. 1994. Now, 1994, if you guys have heard me talk before, this was also known as the Archon invasion. Cobra's done a lot of intel about this. 1994 to 1996, Archon invasion. That should be taken into account with all of this. 94, the aerial school incident in Zimbabwe involved over 60 school children who claimed to have seen a UFO land and encountered small beings near their school. Okay, now again, this is why I say we have to take everything in context. The Archon invasion during those years meant that there possibly was quite a lot of lower interdimensional beings that were let in to this planet. And so this could contribute to some of this as well. 1997, the Phoenix Light incident involved thousands of witnesses in Arizona and Nevada observing a V-shaped formation of lights silently moving across the sky. 1997, Heaven's Gate. And there was a lot of conversation around this at the time because basically they all committed mass offings and they believed that they would, be taken aboard a spaceship, right? So the question also then, remember, that's why I said context is everything. 1994 to 1996, Archon invasion. This happened 1997. It is very possible that during those years, during the Archon invasion, a lot of people were receiving contact. Okay, that could have been contact, like the government could have been receiving contact. There could have been a lot of individuals who believed they were making contact, but with whom? Who are you making contact with? That is why in the spiritual community, in any type of work that involves like channeling, receiving messages, like all this stuff, it requires a lot of discernment. And that takes a lot of time because there are a lot of interdimensional beings that are sending messages in the wavelengths. Okay. There's also things like MK, right? They are also sending messages along the wavelengths. Okay. This is why, especially like if you go back to like Celtic times and ancient practices that involved magic of any kind, they would always tell you, you have to be wary of who you're connecting with, because all the messages exist on the radio stations, and it depends the radio station that you are tuning into. And then this leads us to the 21st century here. So the 2000s, new investigations and revelations. Now, in the 2000s, we had Pluto in Sagittarius. So, right, we're having a lot of transformative real life experiences. We are also having huge revelations in terms of truth coming out. Lived wisdom, right? A Sagittarius can also be extremely dogmatic, extremely opinionated. And so I think that that was part of that culture as well. We also had Neptune in Aquarius and Uranus in Aquarius during the 2000s. Now, Neptune was in Aquarius the entirety of the 2000s. Uranus was in Aquarius from 2000 to 2004. This is where things get interesting. Okay, this is where things start getting weird. Of course, this also brings me to like thoughtful questions of like 9/11 and, you know, just stuff that is just weird, right? And of course, the 2000s, like this is when we entered a new millennia. A lot of people thought, you know, this was the end of the world. And, you know, just there was a lot of kind of unknown things going on, and we weren't really sure like what was happening. This was also the age of the internet. Okay, so 2004, the USS Nimitz UFO incident involved Navy pilots encountering a tic-tac shaped UFO off the coast of California. The pilots described the object's capabilities as beyond any known technology. This is very Uranus in Aquarius, conjunct Neptune in Aquarius, okay? 2007, the Chilean Air Force UFO encounter involved a Navy helicopter crew who recorded a UFO emitting a gas or liquid trail. Okay. 2007, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, that's a mouthful, was revealed to have been secretly funded by the U.S. government to investigate UFOs. The program ran from 2007 to 2012, though its findings were only made public a year later. Like I said, they always say they shut something down. Okay, but they don't. The 2010s, unprecedented government acknowledgement. Why? Because Pluto was in Capricorn. So Pluto was unearthing and revolutionizing and transforming Capricorn, rules the government, okay? They had to start revealing things. They were forced to. Now, were they forced to? The question remains, if they've had contact seemingly since the 1900s, early 1900s, are they being forced to reveal by galactics and extraterrestrials? Or are they doing it because they know that these sightings, it is all going to increase? And if they don't reveal it, then they're going to look like the bad guys because they didn't tell anybody and now it's just commonplace. It's happening every day. I don't know. But Pluto was in Capricorn. Neptune was in Pisces. Shit was weird. The veil was very thin. And of course, we had Uranus in Aries from 2011 to 2018 squaring Pluto in Capricorn. So there was a lot of people like demanding transparency from the government, demanding change, right? So 2010, we had the China airport incident, which involved the temporary shutdown of an airport due to the sighting of an unidentified object near the runway. Very Neptune and Pisces, if you ask me. 2017, New York Times revelations. The New York Times included the release of 3 Pentagon UFO videos and details about the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. That's so many words. These revelations marked a significant shift in public perception. Again, Uranus in Aries squaring Pluto in Capricorn. Uranus in Aries, we were demanding certain things from the government, right? 2018, the Toe the Stars Academy of Arts and Science, led by former Blink 182 musician Tom DeLonge, didn't know this, and former government officials, was launched to investigate UFOs and promote scientific research into unidentified phenomenon. Now, 2018 is when Uranus moved into Taurus. Okay, so it started shaking up our idea of this stable reality. Okay, 2019, the US Navy confirmed the authenticity of the 3 Pentagon videos, acknowledging that the objects observed were classified as unidentified phenomenon. Now we have 2020. The Pentagon officially established the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon, aka UAP, Task Force, under the oversight of the Navy. The primary objective of this task force was to improve the understandings of UAPs and their potential threat to national security. Well, I thought back in the 70s you already said that you investigated and it wasn't a threat, right? That's what you said. The formation of this unit signified a renewed and serious approach toward investigating and analyzing aerial encounters. Of course, 2020, right? We were on lockdown, all these things. Why were we on lockdown? And again, you can go down many rabbit holes with this, right? Why did they lock us down? Was it because, okay, Uranus was in Taurus, Neptune was in Pisces, they were in a sextile. Uranus shaking up the stability of our reality, Neptune and Pisces dropping the veil, Pluto and Capricorn, right, requiring the transformation of our authority figures, right? Revealing the kind of uglier side of it. Was part of that to prevent us from seeing what was going on? Who knows? Because everyone in the world was completely immersed and distracted by the pandemic from 2020 to like 2022. Was there a window where we were supposed to be seeing something else? And why would the establishment of UAP task force in 2020 be relevant? Why would you pick that year when there's a million other things going on that are quite literally more important than that during that time? But let's establish a UAP task force. Okay, 2021. Release of the UAP assessment. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence released a preliminary assessment report on UAPs. This report analyzed 144, interesting number, UAP incidents between 2004 and 2021. Remember in 2004, if we go back to our notes here, 2004, we had Neptune in Aquarius and Uranus in Aquarius. That's when a lot of galactic activity, I think, was going on. So they released a report analyzing 144 incidents with only one incident that could be explained. The report highlighted that UAPs potentially pose flight safety issues and may represent advanced technologies possessed by foreign adversaries. This also is interesting, right? I didn't know about this report at this time, but it makes sense as why were we having so many airplane issues, so many airplane malfunctions, grounding planes, canceling flights. Could there be something else going on in the skies that can explain this, right? 2022, the Department of Defense announced the creation of an all-domain anomaly office. Like, what are these names? Anyways, this was supposed to supersede this UAP task force. The formation of this office mission was expanded beyond aerial phenomenon to include unidentified objects in space, underwater, and transmedium objects. This office operates under the Secretary of Defense and aims to synchronize efforts across the Department of Defense and other federal agencies. So now all of a sudden you are studying unidentified objects in space and underwater. Interesting. Remember, Neptune is still in Pisces at this time in the later degrees in 2022. Okay. Now, also, NASA announced plans to conduct an independent study on UAPs to advance scientific understanding of these phenomenons. The study aimed to identify available data, blah, blah, blah. Okay, interesting. Now they're getting NASA into it. They also said UAPs and unidentified objects in the sky pose potential flight safety issues. So why is this not being told when we're talking about all these kind of things going on with planes and travel, right? Okay, then also in 2022, NASA officially assembles a 16-member independent study team, comprising experts from various fields, including astronomy, physics, astrobiology, and data science. They were supposed to study all this classified data, blah, blah, blah. Okay, 2023. The office of whatever they've named this now provided its first public briefing outlining its structures and objectives and findings. The office reportedly analyzed hundreds of new UAP reports, with some cases resolved as airborne clutter, weather phenomenon, or foreign surveillance drones. However, a significant number of incidents remain unexplained. June of 2023. Now, by this point, Saturn is in Pisces, just so we know. Saturn and Neptune are now in Pisces here, okay? And they are sextiling Uranus and Taurus, okay? June of 2023, NASA's independent study team held a public meeting. They noted challenges in studying UAPs, including stigmas associated with reporting, lack of consistent data, blah, blah, blah. Again, they're trying to come from the mind. They're trying to come from this analytical perspective, which while Saturn and Neptune were in Pisces, that just wasn't going to fucking happen, okay? July of 2023, this is also where it gets interesting. July of 2023, Neptune, Saturn in Pisces, Uranus and Taurus. The North Node moves into Aries, okay? So this is where we started to feel this sense of like sovereignty. We need to like take action, take initiative, right? We have a whistleblower. Okay. Whistleblower David Grush, a former intelligence officer, testified before a House Oversight Committee alleging that the U.S. government possesses non-human spacecrafts and has been covertly studying them for decades. Shocking. We already knew that. Grush claimed the information about these programs was illegally withheld from Congress and that he faced retaliation for his disclosures. Alongside Grush, retired Navy pilots Ryan Graves and David Fravor shared firsthand accounts of UAP encounters and advocated for transparency. 2024. This little office that they've created again, whatever the name of it is, released an annual report which detailed advancements in data collection, blah, blah, blah. They reported a decrease in unexplained cases because now they're just making things up. Now we're just going to make up whatever we want to explain these cases and it's all good, right? April of 2024. Okay, this is interesting. NASA's independent study team published its final report outlining comprehensive strategies for studying UAPs. The report established a dedicated research program within NASA, and the study emphasized the need for increased UAP reporting, and basically we need to be more open to seeing these things occur. Now, April of 2024, we had the total solar eclipse in Aries. And that's going to linger for quite a while. And now we get to 2026, right? Where we've had the drop of the UFO files, supposedly. They've dropped both parts of them. It's nothing we don't already know. I mean, it's kind of cool to look through them and like, you know, see what's there, but it's nothing that we don't already know, right? And so now the question is like, what is the next evolution of this, right? So we've kind of gone through these eras and these decades where a lot of it was just, it was always been like, oh, this is just unexplained phenomenon, you know, or they make up something to explain it, or they just leave the public kind of in the dark about it. And then you start getting into the more modern times where people are demanding answers. They're demanding transparency. So now you're forming all these task force and all these fucking Office of Scientific Research people. And then you're just going to come out and give us excuse after excuse of what we can clearly see is otherworldly activity. Okay. But then we start to have whistleblowers, and then we start to have more transparency. So again, my question is, why drop the files now? And I feel it's because this is going to become more normalized. Remember, Pluto in Aquarius, and I will talk more about Pluto in Aquarius throughout this series. Neptune in Aries, Uranus in Gemini. I believe that, and I will talk about this in the next part of the series, but I do believe that first contact is more of a time thing. It's a timeline thing. It's a dimensional thing. And so I believe that the future and the present, I think time is speeding up. I do have a lot of theories on how they've tried to slow us down, because time is not linear, right? And I do have a lot of theories on how they've tried to halt time. And I do feel now time is very much speeding up, Saturn and Aries. And so the future is merging with the present at a much faster rate, which means everything that is beyond our five senses and the greater perceivable reality. I think we're going to start perceiving more of reality. I think we are going to start having more abnormal experiences become very normal, right? What used to be weird and unexplainable and paranormal start to actually become normal. And so I think we're being prepared for that in many ways. And that's why I think they're dropping the files and talking about these things. The question is, like, people have been like, oh, are they going to try to do a Project Bluebeam sort of thing, as another distraction or to like bring fear of people? I don't know about that. I personally feel like the powers that be are more afraid of us understanding very deeply that we live in a very interdimensional space and not just this 3D construct. I think that's a bigger threat to the powers that be than it is to us. So I don't know if that's going to be something that they do. But nonetheless, I feel it's interesting to look at the patterns here. It's interesting to see what has led up to this point and where we are now. And yeah, this will lead me into talking about some of the predictions made about the summer of 2026. But this is the history. This is the modern history of what has led to this point, and kind of, I think, seeing that this is not new, right? I don't think any of these things are new. And so it's not like this massive disclosure that nobody knows about. I think it's just more of recognizing that in modern times, and again, I like to look at that 1830s to 1890s, that was when Neptune was being discovered. And Neptune has a load to do with seeing beyond the veil, with seeing interdimensional realities, with being able to perceive and sense things that are outside of the norm. And jump to the 1930s, right? 1940s is when they jump to, is when increased UFO activity and all these reportings happening. 1930s when Pluto was discovered. And so again, question mark on a lot of these outer planets, in ancient astrology, starting with all they knew was the sun and the moon, because that's all that was observable. And then over time, through ancient astronomy and astrology, they started to recognize additional planets, right? Like Mercury and Venus and Mars, and then Jupiter and Saturn, right? And when you discover a new planet, or it comes into your awareness, you're not really discovering it, but it comes into your awareness, okay? That means that the energy of that planet is now affecting the consciousness, right? And so the more kind of planets or asteroids or dwarf planets or whatever, the more you are aware of, the more it starts affecting human consciousness. And there are evolutions. Like, there's a lot of ancient research as to when Mercury and Venus and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn started to be integrated into astronomy and astrology. human civilization made a quantum leap. Why? Because you're bringing more archetypes in. You're expanding awareness, you're expanding consciousness, and so civilization's going to increase. We have had Uranus since 1781, Neptune since the 1860s, Pluto since 1930. So we are in the process now where we are making those quantum leaps. I wouldn't be surprised also if we start discovering new asteroids, new planets, new constellations, whatever that may be, because it's marking the time where human civilization is making a quantum leap. And I believe that comes with first contact. And again, like I said, I think we've already made contact a million times with many levels and frequencies of dimensional beings from the lowest to the highest, right? What we haven't done is made contact with our future selves that already exist on the timeline. We haven't made contact with the future Earth, with the new Earth. That's a different type of contact, right? That's this way, the sliding scale of time, versus this way, which is dimensionally speaking. So that's the introduction to the First Contact summer series, and I will see you guys for part 2.